Our next speaker is Kris Millegan. Kris Millegan is a writer, researcher, and publisher whose father was in the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, Military Intelligence, G2, and later in the CIA, rising to branch chief, head of intelligence analysis for East Asia. His father told him things he didn't understand in the late 60s. These revelations led to over 30 years of research into the subjects of CIA drugs, clandestine operations, and secret societies. His publishing house, Trine Day, brought Anthony Sutton's America's Secret Establishment, an introduction to the Order of Skull&Bones to a wider audience, published the book Expendable Elite by Lieutenant Colonel Dan Marvin, a tale of Special Forces commander and his tangles with the CIA. Trine Day's most recent release is Fleshing Out Skull&Bones. Trine Day also has the book Ambushed, Secrets of the Bush Family, the Stolen Presidency, 9/11 and 2004, coming out in April. Kris produced 2 CIA drug symposia in 2000 that brought together top researchers, whistleblowers, authors, and academicians in the field. He lives in a rural community outside Eugene, Oregon. Please welcome Kris Millegan.
Well, howdy do, and thank you very much. And I want to thank Carol for putting this on, and thank the people that helped her, because, like the lady said, I've done some of these things, and they're a hard thing to pull off. And I appreciate her work, and I appreciate all of you folks coming out here to listen to us. And thank you. Well, I'm kind of a hippie, and you learn some things being a hippie, learn about a couple things, and one thing, the hippie philosophy kind of it boils down to 2 things. Basically, respect your Mother Earth and your fellow brothers and sisters, and then to question authority. And that is what we are doing here today, is questioning authority. And generally, I can talk a lot, and I generally talk for a couple hours. So one thing I'm doing today is I'm kind of starting off at the end, because generally after I talk, people say, well, what can we do? What are we going to do? And, Mr. Gandhi was an amazing fellow. And, he basically got the British out of India. And one of the first things he did, they told him that an Indian couldn't manufacture salt. An Indian had to buy the salt from the British, or who they told him to. Well, he said, what do you mean? And he organized a march, and they marched down to the ocean, and he got some salt water to come up and let it evaporate and made salt, And these people, that we're dealing with aren't going to leave out of an election, They know all our hopes and our fears, and they play on our hopes and our fears. And I personally think, I've been looking at it a long time, and from Anthony Sutton, who's been looking at it a long time, he said, these people aren't going to get elected out. But their corruption is so outrageous that it won't last forever. And people see the corruption, and that's one reason why we're here. And how are we going to get rid of this corruption? My personal thing is I think that it's going to take nonviolence, peaceful demonstrations, because there are way more of us than there are of them. And we can take back our republic with pots and pans. And like he says there, he says, when I despair, I remember that all through history, the way of truth and love has always won. There have been tyrants and murderers, and for a time, they can seem invincible. But in the end, they always fall. Think on it. Always. Next slide. It'll come back at the end. God, man, and magic at Yale. That's basically what I speak about, and we aren't going to be able to get into all of this. Okay, the order of Skull and Bones, mass psychology, propaganda, the Hegelian dialectic, and current events. Okay, there was a decision made by these people, okay, in the early 1900s, to go with the new scientific thing of propaganda and use propaganda and mass psychology on us people to move us in the direction that they wanted to use. And then they use the Hegelian dialectic, and they pay a lot of attention to the extremes, and they've created, well, I shouldn't say they've created, but they have tried to influence always the left and the right to try and control both sides to move history in the direction where they want to. When Hegel was talking about the dialectic, he was saying, well, this is kind of how history works. Well, these guys looked at that and they says, well, yeah, that's kind of true. That's kind of how history works. It goes to one extreme and then the other extreme and whatnot. So they started to create these extremes to play them against each other. Next slide. Skull and Bones. I mean, they are a secret society. They have been around officially as the Order of Skull and Bones since 1832, okay? That's generations. We are dealing with lies that were told before we were born. And one of the things that Skull and Bones did, one of the very first things they did, if you look at their membership list, you see a lot of teachers and a lot of reverends. And they took over our education system very, very early on. Brought us an education system that was developed in Prussia. The Prussians were very mad at the people because Napoleon beat them up in the early 1800s. And Johann Wolfgang Fichte, in his third address to the German people, says, we're going to take your children and we're going to teach them what and how and when to think. And they even took kids by bayonet point. And they took them to the schools, and they created 3 schools. They created the folk schools. They created the institutes for the helpers of the elites, and then the academies for the elites. And in the folk schools, what they found is if they took the classical education, which was kind of in around and everything kind of related, they says, well, if we just take the subjects apart, teach them for about an hour, put bells in between, sound familiar, we can create a false construct around people. And then by manipulating the extremes of that construct, we can continually move on through generations and dumb us down. Okay? And I mean, and they've been especially about our civic heritage, about what we are. I mean, they've been working very hard to convince us all we live in a democracy. We live in a democracy. Well, we don't. We live in a republic. And my rights come from God. They do not come from a piece of paper. They do not come from a vote of the people. And that piece of paper, that Constitution, limits the power of government. But they have, I'm 54 years old. I did not have a civics class. My older brother had a civics class, but they have continued to move it down. And then, seems like those are skulls and bones and whatnot. Now, where do you see that symbol? You see that symbol on bottles of poison. Why? Because it'll kill you. It's death. These guys are the brotherhood of death. Okay? When you look at like conspiracy literature, and I've spent my time looked at a lot of conspiracy literature, and one thing I want to tell people is caveat lector, be aware of what you read. And be especially aware of what you believe. Because I can show you a conspiracy book, blame it on these people, a whole bunch of different people. Because a conspiracy theory does not have to be true to have an effect. And they always denigrate conspiracy theories, but they're playing us with conspiracy theories all the time. Next slide.